We've got 2 presentations left this afternoon before we turn you loose for merriment and mayhem in Madison. So with that, Kristine Williams is the Planning and Corridor Management Program Director, Center for Urban Transportation Research, University of South Florida in Tampa. Did I get all that right? All right. 28 years.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Retirement on the horizon?
Hopefully.
Hopefully. But in a list of her accolades is, I would be reading it for the next 10 minutes, and she only has 30 minutes to present. So with that, I'm just going to tell you that she's responsible for the Access Management Manual and version 2, and probably also version 1, and probably version 3 if you're still around, right? Yeah. All right. So with that, please warm welcome Kristine Williams.
Thank you, and I'm trying to figure out how to turn that. So yeah, thank you very much, and this subject is really where my career all started, back in actually in Michigan, before I went to Tampa. I'm from Michigan originally. And I did some work with the Michigan Society of Planning Officials. You can all hear me okay? Yes. Okay. On land division and access controls. And went to Florida and just fell into this wonderful job at the University of South Florida. Which is a research center, policy research center, and applied research. So the Florida Department of Transportation had contacted my new boss and said, we need something on how to work with local governments, because we're having a lot of issues with access management on the highway system. And he said, well, great, we just got this new person in who's done that work in Michigan. And so they funded a project, a very small budget back in those days, to develop some model regulations. And that's where my story started and kind of grew from there. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about, how some of the issues and some of the strategies. And I think there's a copy of the model, right, in the folder. It's great that Wisconsin has authority to review subdivision plats along the highway system. Florida does not, Florida DOT. But this issue of how do we get a handle on that land division activity that happens outside of the subdivision process was a big part of this. Some of the issues we were seeing was coordination and access and development permitting, inconsistencies in requirements, inadequate review of site plans or lack of site plan review, inconsistencies with state standards, so all of those typical things that I think you've heard about in other sessions. And if you look at some of these antiquated plats in Florida, I have a lot that you can buy in the state of Florida, right? You remember that? Those old advertisements, and so a lot of this problem still exists, but new ones are being created, and these flag lot plats like you see here, this one, they just stack them at a certain size to avoid triggering the subdivision review process, and they do it incrementally over time, and then sell them off. And of course the flag lots create these essentially shared private easements that people fight over in terms of, how do we maintain them and who's going to maintain them. And here they're all kind of leading into the median opening on a really important state highway. And so ultimately what happens is the local government gets to knock on the door and says, you need to come out here and build a street. And so we've got a problem in terms of those costs being shifted onto the public that as a result of really poor land division activity and patterns and processes. So that's what we were looking at helping DOT solve. And oh, this is just illustrating some typical problems that are still going on. This little pork chop was put in, and this access too close to the intersection recently in my neighborhood. And what should have been access to the side street is instead just access to a dumpster. So instead, they could have easily used that road. So a lot of problems are still popping up all over the place, and I have to ask myself why. So we got to get that information out, do some training, and help local agencies deal with these issues. So in the 90s, we started the first model, which then became widely adopted. These regulations were used and applied throughout the U.S. in local governments, and also by state DOTs who picked them up, and MPOs who put them on their website. And so we wanted to make this information very available to the local governments, because all of these properties were really starting to, it was just exploding. As you know, the growth in Florida, we're now the third largest state. We just exceeded the population of New York. We have 27 MPOs. So we've exploded in population. We continue to do so. But during this period of the go-go 90s, you were seeing these properties all up and down U.S. Highway 98, a major evacuation route in the Florida Panhandle. And you can't really see it, but it was like 100 by 500 or something in dimensions. And so each of these individual land divisions obviously were going to create pressure for access on the highway system. So one of the things that Florida DOT asked us to do was to go out and do some training. And we did training all up and down the Panhandle. Gary Sokolow and I wish I had the photos of us back then. And as a result of that, he was pleased to know that actually local governments were very supportive of access management. They were just becoming aware of what the strategies were and really appreciated the model and took it and used it. And as a result, we started to see the development. What you see now is a completed service road network along U.S. Highway 98, Okaloosa County, which took it and then said, hey, we've got all this development coming in. Let's use our authority under growth management to force the issue of service roads along this highway and our concurrency requirements back then, which basically required developers to mitigate if the level of service was exceeded. And we saw also across the state of Florida just widespread adoption of all kinds of new updates to their existing codes and plans, because the model, by the way, also has model plan policies and all kinds of information in it. So, and some intergovernmental coordination measures were taking place because the districts were starting to then, through their permitting process, reinforce these strategies, including cross-access, interparcel cross-access on the part of the local agencies. So what did we do to really make all this happen? That's one of the things I wanted to share with you. So once the model was done, we would go in and in various regions, we would do an audit using kind of a checklist approach of all the access management techniques, and review or evaluate the codes and plans of the local agencies within that area and document that result. So did they have, for example, did they regulate connection spacing? Was it consistent with FDOT? Did they have corner clearance requirements? Did they have policies in their plan? All of that Then we would develop a full study report on that with recommendations of what they could change and referencing back to the model code. Did training workshops with the staff along that corridor in that region. We also did presentations to policymakers, the commissions or the MPO boards, to help them understand what we were doing and the benefits of that. And we even got some commissioners coming to our workshops when we were workshopping the changes, and some follow-up to help along the way as if they were updating something or their requirements. And that proved very, very successful. And also, we prepared this very low budget, simple 10 ways to manage roadway access in your community brochure, and sent it out to elected officials, commissions and councils all over Florida, who then, this also, by the way, got picked up by APA, American Planning Association nationally, was on their website for a while, and many other states picked it up and adapted it, and all of this information, by the way, if you want any of it, feel free to use it. We certainly, there's no pride of authorship here, so we'll give you any of the files you want. But it was all about promoting this idea. And we get questions like, oh, well, what is access management? We want to be sustainable. What does access management have to do with sustainability? And we talk about all those issues and help, because what we found was at the local government level, the number one thing was they needed help selling it. It wasn't so much that the staff didn't get it or didn't want to do it, but they really did need some technical assistance on what are the latest strategies, but they also needed help selling it to their commissions and their policymakers and to the public to a certain extent. So a little bit of that. So recently, September 2017, we did a second edition because of all the changes that have happened since then, since the 90s, and the 2 access management manuals that have been published. And so the local government strategies that are in the second edition TRB Access Management Manual are discussed in this model report. So, you know, if you want that part, you don't have to buy the manual. You can just download this report. So the first half of the report goes through the different strategies and explains the rationale, and then it links to the model regulations in the second half, basically. And so that's what, and so in the appendix, we have model policies for comprehensive plans. We have example cross-access agreement templates. We have US Highway 19 Access Management Plan Ordinance, like an overlay district, and some other thing, something else that I forget right now. The other thing that happened during this recent period in Florida was that the Florida Department of Transportation adopted a complete streets implementation plan, and they developed these context classifications that said we're going to design our roadways differently depending on the context, the land use context in which they occur. So the question came up, well, how does access management play into that? And how can we help reinforce it through the model access management regulations? And so this template talks about, for the different general contexts like rural, suburban, fringe, suburban, and compact urban, what might be, how the strategies for access management might differ. So you're, from a land division perspective, you're establishing lot split and dimensional controls in your rural and suburban areas. You're maintaining them as you get into the suburban built environment. But in the compact urban, you're really trying to reinforce those city blocks. And so that's showing how these different strategies are going to vary according to context. We followed that through into the model regulations. I'll talk about that in a minute, but this is just kind of a picture of the inside. So you have some introductory material and commentary under the various sections. and text that you can just take and adapt and modify for your community, as well as some different options. So for example, you could either do a category system that you assign to your entire major thoroughfare routes within your community, or you could tie your access spacing to speed limit. And those are two different approaches. One requires you to go through a planning process where you're assigning standards based on functional class of that roadway and an access category. Another automatically applies the standards based on the speed limit of the roadway, which is a little easier and simpler. So this is the one where you're doing categories. Now the other thing we did was we adapted the category system. So Florida DOT has 7 access categories, which with different standards. And essentially, what this is it's a thoroughfare plan. It's saying if you have a high-level, highly controlled access roadway, that's going to be a category A. It's going to have direct access to abutting land is going to be controlled to preserve safe and efficient through movement. And we're going to have medians. We're going to have separation of signals. And street network has to be planned to support access. Down to B, they support mobility across urban areas and have somewhat less continuity. They may have alternated painted left turn lanes, but down here, and these are relating to context classification, which you don't really need to worry about. And then these roadways, C, support mobility in dense urban contexts. And they have lower speeds to accommodate compact development and more community activity, walking and cycling. And then the spacing criteria applied based on those descriptions. So we wanted modal priority, we wanted context, and all of those issues addressed. Network development is one of the reasons why we need good access management, right? Because of the lack of continuous network as developments occur, and this discontinuity was something that we found everywhere when we were doing our studies. And so having those connections take place means one has to have policies in the plan, but also regulations that require it as the plats come in and require that connection so this is all plans shall contribute to developing a street system that allows access to and from the development and to future development within a quarter-mile radius. So what we're saying is we want good accessibility to that developed area. We want a good street network and excellent circulation at in the local area, but good control on the major routes that we need for through movement. And just some illustrations of those two things. And so we did have in Florida, again, and this is, I think this is US Highway 19, but it might not be, but all up and down US Highway 19 and also in Hernando County to the north of us, service roads were being put in through the use of these strategies and service road ordinances as well. And now what's happening is DOT is going in and having certain projects where they're either realigning them and connecting them into a signal, just kind of improving upon them. Because sometimes as the development process takes place, they're not always, exactly where they need to be. Now these, after a while, the development community just took it for granted. We're going to have to put these roads in now. We know we're going to have to put them in, and even where they weren't necessarily required, they were starting to put them in the network. So, and this actually in Hernando County started before our model ordinance, but it's been moving forward much more quickly across the state. In rural areas, another strategy that provides some low cost, first of all, requiring subdivisions to be designed with shared access to and from the highway system. But then some low-cost alternatives to strips are to work with the rural owners on some small concept plans, and also allow for shared gravel access drives when it's only going to serve a few residences, with some simple design criteria for those. And this strategy was taken from Rural by Design, Randall Arendt, who published that work, but allowing gravel and with certain minimum standards. So that's another example for a rural area. Land division activity, certainly here we see the flag lots, strip lots, those long bowling alley lots that then become single access cul-de-sacs, which can create emergency access problems and a lack of connectivity. So we have provisions that restrict the length of that cul-de-sac, but also any new lot splits. And this is an example. This one was in that US 19 overlay that I mentioned. No new or additional access rights are going to be permitted for properties created as a result of lot splits after enactment of this ordinance. That stopped lot split activity in its tracks on Highway 19. It's similar to this approach that you see, where essentially you could establish an overlay on a high priority corridor and permit one access per existing lot or parcel, but prevent any future connections for lots. Any new lot that's created subsequent to the ordinance would have to obtain access through an internal access road. So these are variations on this theme. That the other thing you'll need is a lot split review process. So for small subdivisions that are not considered plats under the statute and under your definition of subdivision plat, you would adopt an ordinance that allows you to review those for consistency with standards, and that gives you that ability to catch those early on. Cross-access is another important issue, and particularly to provide different ways to get in and out of a site that might feed into a signal is very helpful, so people can make a safe left turn. And getting those cross-access agreements in place is a strategy that we describe in the model. Basically, if there's a change in use or new development that takes place along these corridors, require that cross-access easement be dedicated. The owner has to record it with the deed, so it runs with the property, not with the owner. If they need temporary access, then you can provide for that as a agreement through an agreement process, joint maintenance agreements, so you can prorate maintenance costs across the cross-access corridor, and provide for some exceptions where it just simply proves impractical. You might have incompatible land uses or other issues, some site-related issues. So establishing that sort of a cross-access ordinance is another strategy that we describe in some detail, and this is just illustrating an example of one. These are two major shopping centers. They have cross-access across the front. They have limited number of driveway access points. And one of the things that's missing is the pedestrian circulation system, which is now another thing that the model talks about. So it also talks about bicycle, pedestrian, and transit access, near side, far side, transit guidelines, and so forth, bus stop guidelines. But here you can see it works really well. We have really good circulation. The trucks can also come in from this access, go around the back of the property. There's parking, or there's loading docks back here, and they can get back out on this major highway. One of the issues is this corner lot right here was under separate ownership and didn't connect in at the time. It was already built, basically, and didn't connect in. So one thing you could do is through your change in use requirements, you say when this property redevelops, there's a change in use, we're going to require them to obtain access via this internal circulation system. That would mean you would also have that provision in this development approval for this property. So you would say if this property ever redevelops, you must provide an access easement into that property. Yes?
I take it it's only the cities that have the authority to grant dedicated access.
Right. So yes, and that was the critical issue, is that so much of this authority is at the local government level. So if you want to do good access management, having the two work together is an ideal situation. Getting into land use regulation at the state level is not recommended. And I don't know that it's even allowed in most states. Typically, it's outside of the authority of a DOT to address land use regulations. Basically, the authority stops where that driveway permit authority stops. Oh, I see. So getting them to adopt a cross-access ordinance or set of requirements for interparcel cross-access would be really, really helpful to you. And I mean, share this with them, because I found that it's a pretty easy sell. The challenge is you got to make sure that those exceptions are provided for. Make it clear that you're working through the process for each development site. But it's having those change in use requirements also, that when there's a change in property, they have to connect in. That's another step of the game that I didn't put in my PowerPoint. I will say, you know, as far as the sales side of it and to the property owners themselves, this gas station would do a lot more business if it had access into the Target and Publix shopping center than it does by being constrained on that corner with just 2 access points. Let me know when out parcel access is another issue where you saw the value of these things in some of the earlier presentations, or if you weren't here the other day, they certainly are very high value to the developer of that property. So one of the things that can be done is to avoid these being split off, sold or leased separately, and then they come in individually with an access permit, is to regulate that entire site that's under common ownership or part of a phased development plan or assembled for development purposes as one property for the purposes of access management, and with this simple set of requirements. And you know, basically the number of connections permitted will be the minimum number necessary to provide reasonable access to the site, and so on and so forth. All access to out parcels has to be internalized using the shared circulation system. And so Section 7 talks about that, as well as corner clearance. And this is an example from the Cape Coral area where they were using these strategies along Pine Island Road. Pedestrian access I mentioned. Here's a driveway into a grocery store near a mobile home park, right next to a mobile home park. And people can't walk into that grocery store safely because basically they're walking in a driveway. And so there's no sidewalk, there's no direct pedestrian access for them into that grocery store. So again, as we're trying to promote active activity and public health and pedestrian walkable environments, having attention to that in the access and traffic impact study and the review of developments, and also driveway permitting is an important strategy. And so this is talking basically about different variations of how you do pedestrian access. And the other side of it is that simply shifting those businesses to the sidewalk is a really good pedestrian access management strategy, because then the pedestrian can access that business directly, doesn't have to walk through a parking lot. The transit, the buses can drop them off and they can get right in. And even for a gas station or a Circle K, a convenience store, it really makes a huge difference without sacrificing any of the functionality, and in fact it actually improves corner clearance and moves those driveway access points further away from the corner. So this is just an illustration of that. And also having those adjacent suburban developments kind of knit together rather than blocking them off, and allowing that in the zoning, allowing some break in the buffers on the side of the businesses so that they can put those pedestrian walkways through. So that's really I thought you were are you ready? So that's the main issue, some of the strategies, but what I want to do is just point out that if you go to our website, and here's how you get there. It's a little bit convoluted, but you go to CUTR, USF EDU, pick research programs, planning, quarter management, and completed reports. All of these documents are on that site, including that brochure, the model access management, multimodal district regulations, and bypass, all kinds of bypass materials that are useful for educating the public and businesses on the impacts of a bypass, and some of the strategies, land use and development and access management strategies they can use on in their community, and corridor preservation practices, and webcasts on these. So I won't belabor it any further, and I'm going to stop there. So happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Kristine?